Today's topic is closely related to one of my favorite documentaries of all time, National Treasure, the film starring Oscar-winning actor Nicolas Cage. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Ben Franklin said that two things in life are certain: death and taxes. But I'd like to add a third certainty, that all conspiracy theories will eventually blame the Freemasons. It doesn't seem to matter what it was, who was involved, or whether or not Freemasonry even existed at the time. Some way, somehow, the Masons were behind it. Flat Earthers say that the Masons propagated the lie that the Earth is a sphere. Now, of course, Pythagoras existed in 500 BC and Masonry didn't. But we've been through the whole flat Earth thing and we won't be going back there anytime soon. Tartaria believers say that Masons were behind the Great Global Reset, for which they've yet to produce any actual date. Like, seriously, guys, when did it happen? I've seen everything from like 1830 up through 1960, come on. Some even claim that Freemasons tried to take over the Italian government in the 20th century, and that one's actually almost kind of true. That's another story for another time. We were gonna cover it here, but it was 3 a.m. last night, and I was not there yet. The most famous Masonic conspiracy of all, however, can be traced to the Catholic Church, which has claimed that Freemasons are in fact a group of Satanists who are plotting the downfall of religion and the creation of a new world order. And while I want to be very clear that this is not going to be an anti-Catholic video, because it's just not going to be an anti-Catholic video, the Catholic Church has also claimed that Masons attempted to assassinate Father John Bosco twice in 1880, and has also insinuated that Masons were behind the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II in 1981. Apparently, we have been quite busy. And it should be noted exactly how serious these accusations are, because when you consider the claim here that all Freemasons are in service of Satan, attempting to destroy religion and create an atheist, naturalist New World Order, you're saying that a large number of the people involved in the founding of the United States were doing that. So, in order to fully understand these accusations, fully understand why it is that today so many people are of the belief that Freemasons are Satanists, we have to explain some things about what Freemasonry is, where it came from, and how it functions. But before we get into all of that, I want to take a moment to talk about our partner for today's video, Delete Me. As someone who is frequently engaged with and involved in debunking and discussing conspiracy theories, I do tend to worry about how much of my own personal information is out there on the internet for anybody to find. And one of the many ways that I safeguard my privacy in order to safeguard my home is with Delete Me. It is commonly said that when you sign up for something that is free, it's because that's not the product. You're the product. What that means is whenever you sign up for a free newsletter or you enter your email to win something in a raffle, your data, whether it's just your email address or sometimes there are more fields, all of that gets pumped to a data broker who then sells it to other people for marketing purposes. We did get some comments last time we did a partnership with Delete Me where people were like, people aren't actually doing that, nobody's selling your data, this is all just a big... No, people are selling your data. I used to work in marketing, it's 100% true. You would be horrified to see how much information I had about people who only filled out something saying they were looking for Medicare. This is not something that I'm saying just to scare you. I used to work in this industry, I know how it works. Your data is out there. And honestly, from the stuff we collected, it would generally, for somebody who knows what they're doing, be possible for somebody to use that information, just purchase it right from a data broker, and get into your life, get into your bank accounts, get into your email, all of these different things, just with information that was sold to them by one of these brokers. We're talking first name, last name, maiden name, date of birth, home address, what star sign you are, all of these different things are things that people who buy from data brokers have access to. Now, if you're wondering what does Delete Me do to help with that, unlike a lot of services that say they'll scan for this data and then they'll file automatic takedowns, Delete Me has an actual person sitting at a desk working to remove your data from sites. They are engaged in the process of going to these brokers and saying, hey, we are filing a legal takedown request. We have the authority of the person who hired us. You must obey. And of course, the way the laws work, these companies can take your data down, and the very next time they have the option to take it from somewhere, they will, and they'll relist it. So what Delete Me does, because they have this belief that you should continue monitoring, is they continue monitoring. If your data reappears somewhere, they will file another takedown request. And they will do this over and over and over again as long as you have a subscription to the service. What's really special is that through our partnership with Delete Me, we are able to offer you 20% off all US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use the code lorelodge at checkout. Subscribers will get a privacy report within 7 days, at which point Delete Me will begin removing all of your personal data like phone, address, and email from all of these data broker sites as long as they can find you listed. They'll then continue to monitor those sites and repeat removals as needed, and even make custom removal requests. Once again, if you would like to give Delete Me a try, you can head over to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use code lorelodge at checkout. Freemasonry is the largest fraternal order in the world, with around 1 million Masons in North America alone and many more in lodges across every continent except Antarctica. For full transparency, I am a 3rd degree Master Mason and a Mark Master Mason in the York Rite. My home lodge is Thompson number 340 right here in Paoli, Pennsylvania, and I've been a Mason since 2021. For anybody who's curious about why a guy like me might have joined Freemasonry, I have a medieval studies degree and I really like National Treasure. If you've ever seen the film, Freemasonry is a pretty core theme of it. A lot of what goes on is attributed to the Freemasons, but unlike most of the conspiracies, in National Treasure, the Freemasons are the good guys. They're presented as the guardians of history. The film's opener connects them back to the Templars and, of course, goes through kind of the Masonic legend that it goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. We'll get into some of that in a moment. But when I watched that movie as a kid, it was part of what formed my interest in history. And by the same token, it was part of what formed my interest in sort of those unsolved mysteries that are out there. You know, the idea that there are treasures we still haven't uncovered, that there are secrets that we can still unfold about our past. If you've been watching the channel a long time, you can probably see that influence factor very heavily into everything we've done. While Nick Cage's character of Benjamin Gates is not himself a Freemason, it's heavily implied that his grandfather's character is, and that this spirit of seeking greater truths about the past carries on through his lineage. I found a lot of inspiration in that, and to this day, National Treasure is one of my favorite rainy day movies. If there's ever something where, you know, I just need something on in the background, or I need something to perk me up, I watch that movie, or I watch the sequel, which honestly is just as good. And I also want to be clear here that this is not an ad. We were not paid to hawk National Treasure like this. I just think National Treasure is a really good movie. My point is to say, National Treasure is kind of, you know, a special film to me, and I remember when a certain Panini was going on a few years ago, I was locked in my house in early 2020, and there was nothing I could really do, so I watched National Treasure again. And if you've seen the movie, obviously there's a lot of mentions of Freemasonry and there's Masonic symbolism, and you know they talk about Ben Franklin, who was of course himself like one of the most important Freemasons of all time, not necessarily to Masonry, but there's a little bit at the end where, you know, Freemasonry is mentioned throughout the film, but at the very end there's an FBI agent, and if you've seen the movie you kind of know how this relationship between him and Ben Gates goes, and they just slip it in. It's a very minor little shot, but it's very, you know, it's very purposeful. That there is a Masonic ring on the FBI agent's finger. And in this scene, he says something to Ben Gates that really makes me think a Mason was involved in writing this movie, and that this wasn't like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, where he was interested and inspired by Masonry, but that somebody in that film process, in that writing process, was a Mason. Because Agent Sadusky looks at Benjamin Gates and he says, "You know, the Templars and the Freemasons believed the treasure was too great for any one man to have, not even a king. That's why they went to such great lengths to keep it hidden." And that scene, with that specific quote and the ring, and just the way those two men talk about this massive treasure that Ben has just found, and duty and patriotism, all of that, it really stuck with me. And it got me interested enough that I called my local Masonic Lodge. About a year later, in the spring of 2021, I was entered, passed, and then finally raised to the degree of Master Mason. And since then, I've spent a lot of time researching the history of the order, studying its philosophy, and in some cases grappling with certain things Masons have said, and wondering if this is something that I truly feel I can be a part of. Many people think that the secrets of Freemasonry are kept in hidden books that only certain people have access to, but the truth is, Essentially, everything that Masons do, what we teach, what we learn, is out there on the internet, and you can go find it for yourself and you can read it. Esoteric works by some of the most famous Masonic authors, such as The Secret Destiny of America and The Lost Keys of Freemasonry by Manly P. Hall. I dropped one, hang on. And perhaps most importantly, Morals and Dogma of the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite by Albert Pike can be purchased on Amazon for like $30. And I think all three of those are also available on sacredtext.com for free. The part that truly interested me the most about Freemasonry, however, was where it originated. What is this order? Where did it come from? Does it really go back to the Egyptian pyramids, or the Temple of Solomon, or the Knights Templar? Or is it just a social club for men that started in England in 1717? This process has given me plenty of time to study a lot of anti-Masonic conspiracies and to track what about them is true, what is misrepresentation, and what is just blatant, forgery. Now, conspiracy theories about Freemasonry often speak of the 33rd degree. They call this the highest rank in Freemasonry and claim that these Masons secretly worship either Lucifer or Baphomet, and that their ultimate goal is the creation of a Luciferian or atheist New World Order. These claims belie a fundamental misunderstanding of what Freemasonry is, how it's structured, and of course, what its goals are. There are a lot of places that we could begin with this topic, but I think the best place to start is, the beginning. There are many legends about the origin of Freemasonry, with some placing it as recently as the Crusades and the Knights Templar, and others pushing it way back to the Egyptians and the pyramids. The earliest date that we can actually prove, however, is around the year 1400 AD. That date comes from the dating of something called the Hallowell manuscript. This was a poem that linguistically was most likely written between 1390 and 1425 AD, though there's been a range presented of anywhere between 1350 and 1450. Part of the reason we don't know the exact origin of this document is because, for most of its existence, it was making its way around various private collections and didn't end up in the hands of anybody who recognized it for what it was until the 1800s. Written in Middle English, the document was transliterated into modern English by John Hallowell in 1840, hence the name Hallowell manuscript. Prior to that, it was referred to as the Regius poem. It should be noted that Hallowell himself was actually not a Freemason. As you might expect, the document has quite a bit to do with the physical art of stonemasonry. This is the practice of using stone as the primary material in buildings or sculptures, and people who practice this are called Masons. The Regius poem itself may be older than the copy that Hallowell had, but as far as we know, that one's from sometime around 1400, and at that time, guilds dominated the medieval economy. Guilds were structured networks run by tradesmen and artisans that ensured people had fair wages and high standards of work across not just cities, but even entire countries. Guilds also had 3 ranks, those being apprentice, journeyman, and master. The manuscript covers the rights and responsibilities of each rank, and it also contains we'll call it a history of the guilds practicing in Britain. According to the story, Masonry was created by Euclid in Egypt during the Hellenistic period. And the precise wording here is that Euclid, as well as his students, counterfeited geometry and called it Masonry. This is the term counterfeit being used in the archaic sense, and what's being said here is that they were creating an imitation of geometry and calling it Masonry. And this is actually our first clue that this document is more than it seems. Even in 1390, it was well known that stonemasonry had existed prior to the time of Euclid, and Euclid is frequently called the father of geometry. So the idea that Euclid, the father of geometry, would take geometry and counterfeit it into operative stonemasonry doesn't really make a ton of sense, and it conflicts with what the author should have known at the time. By making Euclid the father of masonry as an imitation of geometry, the author of the document is telling us that this is about more than just stoneworking. Something is going on here that is being veiled as a set of guidelines for the operative craft. This sort of double meaning is frequently used in Masonic lessons, which tend to use allegory to explain philosophic and moral concepts. Many Masonic degrees, or the sort of play-acting process by which somebody is taught a Masonic lesson, are similar in function, I would say, to many of those that Jesus uses in the New Testament. The Hallowell manuscript also tells us that the earliest Freemasons were explicitly Christian, charging members with the responsibility to love God well and the Holy Church. And it goes on to give instruction on the many ways in which Masons should strive to imitate Christ and follow his teachings. And furthermore, it says that they should treat church and the Mass with extreme reverence. As for how the craft came to England, the document tells us that it arrived in the year 926 AD during the reign of King Athelstan, who was the grandson of King Alfred the Great of Wessex. Athelstan is also arguably the first king to rule all of the territory that is now considered England. And according to the document, it was there at York, under King Athelstan's supervision, that the Masons created their 15 articles and 15 points of moral duty. And in doing this, they further refined the Masonry created by Euclid. As I said, the 15 points and 15 articles are labeled the moral duties of Masonry, but there is more to the text, including a reference to the 4 crowned ones and the 7 sciences, known today as the liberal arts. Now, the reference to the crowned ones here is a little bit complicated because the 4 crowned ones are actually not the ones who should have been referenced here. They're the anonymous people who were not involved in the episode that's described. The 5 other crowned ones, the 4 crowned ones are actually 9 crowned ones. The point here is that the 4 mentioned were not the right 4 that should have been the other 5. And those 5 were Christian Masons who did work that was actually beloved by the Emperor Diocletian, but Diocletian came around and said, hey, could you build me an idol? And they said no. So Diocletian, doing the thing that's completely normal and acceptable and understandable of a man who has been told, sorry, we can't do business with you, but the sculptor down the street might, is that he had them encased in lead caskets and thrown into the sea. The reign of Diocletian was not a good time to be a Christian. As to the 7 sciences, those are in order given as grammar, dialect, rhetoric, music, astronomy, arithmetic, and geometry. Now, the 7 sciences given here and the 7 liberal arts that we recognize today form the core foundation of Masonic philosophy. It should also be said that while the Halliwell manuscript is the oldest Masonic document we have, it is certainly not the first. Unfortunately, these documents have been lost to time, though some evidence does suggest there may be a connection to the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were founded in the year 1119 by Hugh de Payenne, and they functioned as something of a police force protecting pilgrims from bandits along the roads to Jerusalem after the First Crusade. And they would also come to be the protectors of the Temple Mount, where the Temple of Solomon once stood. By the end of the Crusades, however, they were one of the most powerful mercenary forces in the entirety of Europe, acting as knights for hire against the enemies of Christendom. And sometimes as knights for hire against other Christians. This position, as well as the wealth that it brought, put them on a collision course with Philip IV of France, who eventually, in 1307, had them tried for heresy in order to seize their wealth and to eliminate their influence. But the Templars weren't just known for fighting, they were also theological scholars in many cases, and they invented the checking system. What I mean by that is that they seem to be the origin of traveler's checks, because the Templars had chapter houses in most of the large cities of Europe, and those chapter houses could function as banks. If there's one place you're probably not going to break in to steal money from, it is a castle occupied entirely by knights. And the way this all developed is that during the Middle Ages, if you were traveling and you didn't have a lot of armed guards, typically you would sew your money into your clothing so that you could just hand off the chests or whatever and you would still have what you needed. But criminals eventually figured this out and they would just rob you of your clothes as well or kill you. The way the Templars made a change is that they said, hey, we can store silver in our chapter houses, we communicate with each other, so we can keep a general balance of how much money we have in each place. And what we can do is you can deposit money at the London chapter, and we'll write you a document certifying that you gave us the money to hold on to. You could then go to the chapter house in Milan, present your certificate saying, hey, I deposited this money with your bank in London, and they would hand it back to you. This worked because if you were traveling along the roads and a brigand came upon you and said, have at thee, stand and deliver your money or your life, whatever, you could look them in the eye and say, the best I can give you is this piece of paper. In order to get the money, you have to take this into a city and bring it to a Templar chapter house and hand it over to them. One thing brigands typically did not do during the Middle Ages was walk into cities and go directly to castles full of knights. So this was a way of ensuring that if you were robbed, the brigand sure as hell wasn't getting any money out of the ordeal. And since your money was still safe in the chapter house you initially went to, you could always go back and get it from them. But this position, as not only one of the most powerful and wealthy mercenary forces, but also kind of the original bankers of Europe, put the Templars on a collision course with King Philip IV of France, who in 1307 had them tried for heresy, and this was really just all so he could seize their wealth and eliminate their influence. Now, of course, the purge of the Templars wasn't limited to France. The Pope couldn't say, hey, it's just these ones in France that are the problem, and make Philip happy, because the Pope was kind of in the pocket of the French king for a while. In fact, if you look at history, the Pope has kind of been in the pocket of the French king for most of it. But what this meant was that the Pope couldn't just demand the purge of the Templars in France. He also had to extend it to everywhere else they operated, which was a little difficult in the Germanies, where they didn't kind of care what the Pope said. They had already had a history of conflict with him. But in places like England and Scotland, he was able to have a little bit more sway. And while the English complied to the extent that they could, Robert the Bruce really did not care. You see, Robert the Bruce was kind of in the middle of a war with England, who had way more people, way more money, and way more farmland, so losing combatants wasn't really something he was into. And he especially was not all that interested in trying his own knights so that the King of France could get some money. By the way, there were only like 20 Templars in the entirety of Scotland, so far as anybody knows. But in any case, the Bruce's half-hearted efforts resulted in the trials of just 2 Templars by the names of Walter de Clifton and William de Middleton. Now, while those are both actually people from Scotland, obviously they have the de in their names because back then French was the lingua franca and the Normans had conquered England. You get where this is going. Naturally, neither Clifton nor Middleton wanted to admit to charges of heresy, and they weren't really asked, hey, did you do a heresy? They were asked to explain what they did as Templars. And according to the 19th century historian Charles Addison, the documents from the trials of the Templars included a description of the Templar initiation ritual, which resembles the Masonic initiation ritual in a lot of ways. That said, all I can really tell you about the Masonic initiation ritual is that I'm not allowed to tell you exactly what goes on, but if you look up first degree initiation ritual Freemasonry, you'll probably find it. Finish the video first, though, because there's something I'm going to explain in a little bit that you need to understand before you just go Googling things about Freemasonry. Despite these possible connections, however, we can't make any sort of certain claims about a Masonic lineage out of the Knights Templar Order. The missing link just isn't there yet. It may exist, and it may be yet to be found, but we don't have the evidence in hand. So for that reason, Masonic history, rather than Masonic tradition or legend, begins in the 15th century. At its origin, due to its connections with actual stonemasonry, Freemasonry had 3 classifications, those being apprentice, fellowcraft, and master. Fellowcraft and journeyman would be synonymous here. Yet in Freemasonry, there seems to have been very little distinction between fellowcraft and master, and they don't appear to have been separate degree processes. You became a fellowcraft and a master at the same time. So obviously I want to talk a little bit about the guild system and how that worked, because as an apprentice, you would join the guild and you would be assigned to a master. That master would provide you with food, they would provide you with shelter, and they would teach you the basics of the craft. Upon completion of your training, you would be made a journeyman or a fellowcraft, and what that meant was that you could go and work for any master in the city, you could work for really any master in the guild. What fellowcrafts could not do was open their own shop, take on their own projects, or train their own apprentices. In order to become a master mason, in the operative sense of the word, actual physical stonemasonry, a fellowcraft would have to have his own work investigated and examined by other master masons. If he passed, he would be raised to the rank of master, he would be able to start his own shop, run his own projects, hire his own fellowcrafts, and take on his own apprentices. If you're seeing any connections between, masonry and guilds and the Jedi Knights, you should. That said, this kind of 3-tiered process was very common throughout medieval Europe. As a knight, you didn't start as a knight, you started as a page, as a young boy, and then you became a squire, and then finally a knight. To that end, it seems likely that the distinction between fellowcraft and master in early Freemasonry was that a master could run a lodge while a fellowcraft had not been authorized to do so. It didn't mean that every master mason was running a lodge, but likely meant they could. In modern Freemasonry, the ranks of entered apprentice, fellowcraft, and master mason are also referred to as the first, second, and third degree. And each of these degrees has its own associated ritual. And as I mentioned earlier, that's kind of some, they basically put on a play, and for those first 3 degrees, it's an interactive play. You're in it, you're part of it. Now, as I said, that's modern Masonry. Those rituals have developed over the years. Back then, there's no mention of any ritual in the Hallowell manuscript, or in fact in any Masonic document up until 1696. And there we see both the rituals of the Entered Apprentice and the Fellow Craft Master degree in the Edinburgh House Register manuscript. In reading that manuscript, you can pick up on the lineage from the Hallowell manuscript, though it was very clear that the craft had evolved and physical stonemasonry was no longer a primary focus. But as I said, that was an Entered Apprentice and then a combined Fellow Craft Master degree. A separate third degree does not seem to have come into existence until after 1720. And the development of the third degree in Freemasonry as its own thing may have been the result of yet another development in Freemasonry, and that was the creation of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717. In that year, a group of Masons from at least 4 lodges in London and Westminster got together to form this Grand Lodge, and what they did was basically just say, alright, here's how I do my ritual, now how do you guys do yours? Combine them, kind of make sure that everybody's on the same page, and then they formalized it, and they said, we're going to practice all of these the same way in our lodges. It would take the Grand Lodge a little while to cover all of England, but the Grand Lodge concept did spread rather quickly. By 1731, there were at least 2 other Grand Lodges in existence, those being the Grand Lodge of Ireland and the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. And it should be noted that while the Grand Lodge of England did initially standardize these degrees, they did not control the other Grand Lodges. If anything, they were sort of in a first among equals position with the Grand Lodges of Ireland and Pennsylvania, and within the next few years after 1731, Massachusetts and Virginia. Massachusetts and Virginia like to argue with Pennsylvania about who the oldest Grand Lodge is, but we're the only ones who can say 1731 with any degree of certainty now, aren't we? Masonry is actually believed to have arrived in Pennsylvania much earlier than 1731 as well. I think the earliest documentation of Freemasonry in Pennsylvania comes from 1715, but it's possible they were there even earlier. As far as what the Grand Lodge had actually done to organize everything, well, that happened in 1723, when they created the first Book of Constitutions. That was written by Presbyterian minister James Anderson, a Scot, and it would form the core of Freemasonry. And even today, that Book of Constitutions, written by James Anderson, is largely unchanged. The Masonic constitutions have not evolved much since then. That constitution was widely adopted throughout England across the 1720s and 1730s, and it was adopted in Pennsylvania by Grand Master Benjamin Franklin, better known for other works. Within that constitution were written the Ancient Charges, a set of obligations given in 6 parts with respect to religion, civic duty, the lodge, other Masons, management of the craft, and overall behavior. Prior to 1723, Freemasonry, so far as we can tell, required belief in the Trinitarian God of Christianity. You could not have any other belief system. It had to be a Trinitarian Christian God. After 1723, the only classification when it came to religion that was banned was atheism. Given the time and place, however, it is very possible, perhaps even likely, that this was not meant to be an acceptance of all religions, but rather a way of dealing with sectarian differences between Protestants and Catholics. Part of the reason that I think this was originally about accepting all kinds of Christians rather than accepting all religions is because the 1535 manuscript written by, the Watson manuscript of 1535 explicitly charges Masons to be true men to God and the Holy Church, which under these circumstances would either have been the Catholic or the Anglican, probably the Anglican. Either way, by 1723, the schism between Protestants and Catholics was much bigger, and there were a lot more Protestants, so it would make sense that later Masonic documents would make allowances to say, hey, all Trinitarian Christians, you're all good, all of you can join, though the 1723 version would also have allowed Unitarian Christians. Masons were also charged to be peaceable subjects to the civil powers, and never to be concerned in plots or conspiracies against the peace and welfare of the nation. At the time that this document was written, England was in the midst of several bloody civil wars, all of which were centered around the idea of whether or not the monarch should be Catholic or Protestant. These wars would not end until 1748, when the Jacobite Rebellion was finally crushed for the last time. If you have seen the television program Outlander, you are familiar with this. Speaking of Outlander, you could have gotten that done in one go. You didn't need a 2-part season 7. Now, charges 3 through 5 are all very specific to the craft of Freemasonry and how to treat other brothers and things like that, so I want to go into 6, which is about dealing with the public. And that informed us that Masons are to be polite and courteous towards strangers, moral and wise at home, and contemptuous of false brothers. The Book of Constitutions would be revised in 1738, and that version would include a full separate third-degree ritual. As for the charges, however, the core philosophy and requirements of being a Freemason, those were largely maintained all the way through to today. All of modern Freemasonry is founded upon these charges and the Book of Constitutions to which they belong, and anything that is in contradiction to them can therefore hardly be called Masonic. I bring that up because 1738 was a very important year for the Freemasons, and not in a good way. That is to say that the order gained a major rival in that year, and that rival is still attacking Freemasonry to this day. In 1738, the Catholic Church banned Freemasonry. Now, Pope Clement XII's reasoning for this ban was steadfast. It was solid. This was really hardcore stuff that he put forward. What he said is that the Freemasons were banned because they weren't Catholics and they might be doing something. Now, of course, that's a little tongue-in-cheek, but I'll quote you his actual reasoning. He said, "Men of any religion or sect satisfied with the appearance of natural probity are joined together according to their laws and statutes laid down for them by a strict and unbreakable bond which obliges them both by an oath upon the Holy Bible and by a host of grievous punishment to an inviolable silence about all that they do in secret together." Now, I will mention we're just breezing past the fact that the oaths are taken on a Holy Bible, but that's neither here nor there. He goes on to say, "Thus these aforesaid societies or conventicles have caused in the minds of the faithful the greatest suspicion, and all prudent and upright men have passed the same judgment on them as being depraved and perverted." Now, here's the kicker. For if they were not doing evil, they would not have so great a hatred of the light. To put that into modern terms, if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to hide. That was the argument that the NSA used when the Patriot Act was challenged. Just to be abundantly clear about what's going on here, Clement said that because they're meeting in secret, they must be plotting the downfall of the Catholic Church. That's kind of like saying, because my girlfriend goes to therapy, she's trying to plan to break up with me. I suppose it also might be improper to point out that the College of Cardinals meets in secret to discuss something every time the Pope dies. But the point here is that Clement XII had absolutely no evidence of wrongdoing and apparently needed none. And while the ban was somewhat effective in rather heavily Catholic Western Europe, it was less effective in Protestant England or her American colonies. We will get into the continued, very contentious relationship between Catholicism and Freemasonry later in the video, but now we need to switch gears a little bit into something that's more about the structure of Freemasonry. Partially because Freemasonry remained popular and completely unbanned in England and the colonies, over the next 150 years after the ban, it continued to develop, and it spawned the York and Scottish Rites. While not the only rites in Freemasonry, the York and Scottish rites are arguably the two most famous in the English-speaking world. It's also worth mentioning that while both rites developed in Europe, England for the York Rite and of course for the Scottish Rite, France, they matured in the United States, and so we're going to be talking about those ones. Of the two, the York Rite is the older, with its origins in the Royal Arch degrees that developed in the UK during the mid-18th century. The earliest record of any York Rite degree being conferred onto somebody in the United States of America, or more properly in the colonies that would become the United States of America, is from 1769. And then the succeeding degrees in the Royal Arch are just after that in the decades that follow. As the Rite grew, so did the number of degrees, and thus the stratification grew to include Royal Arch Masonry, Cryptic Masonry, and the Knights Templar. The Royal Arch, those first 4 degrees in the York Rite, was established by 1798, but they're definitely older than that. We just don't know exactly how much older. And Royal Arch Lodges came to refer to themselves as chapters. Cryptic Masonry, the next set, is comprised of 3 degrees and appears to have developed by the 1810s, if not earlier, and their lodges were referred to and are referred to as councils. Finally, the Knights Templar are the terminal degrees of this rite. Members are required to have completed the Royal Arch degrees and sometimes also the Cryptic Masonry degrees. As for Knights Templar lodges, those are referred to as commanderies, and there are multiple degrees within the Knights Templar. I do think here is probably a good place to interject that rites in Masonry are combinations. They are structures of degrees. The York Rite is not universal, and in fact, it's mostly just practiced in the United States and Canada, and for that reason, it's often called the American Rite. That's why over in the UK, they have the Royal Arch, but it's not part of the York Rite. And each rite is then formed from a set of individual degrees. A degree may exist in a rite in one place, in one jurisdiction, and it may just be a separate independent thing on its own in another. And then in a third, it may be part of another rite not connected to the first rite. So basically, Freemasonry is not nearly as organized as people seem to think it is. You can kind of think of the degrees like college football teams if you're American and familiar with college football. I tried to think of something else, but this is the one that made the most sense. What I mean by that is that you might have a college football team, like, say, Penn State, who plays other teams who are in the Big Ten. In this case, Penn State would be the degree, and the Big Ten would be the rite. The way the analogy works is that you can go see the Penn State degree as part of the Big Ten rite, but you might also go see the Notre Dame degree that is not connected to any rite. Or you may go see the Alabama degree, which is connected to the SEC rite. That's like the best way I can put it into layman's terms for the most Americans. Now, we could have done the analogy with soccer, but those degrees would be very long, very boring, and nothing would happen and nobody would care. Unless you're European, in which case you'd care entirely too much, apparently. We kid, we love our European followers. Just a little friendly joshing across the pond. For our European followers, joshing means a little banter. Anyway, after that long-winded digression, the point of the matter is that there are three sections of the York Rite. They are the Royal Arch, Cryptic Masonry, and the Knights Templar Commandery. What's most crucial to recognize about the Templar degrees is that they have a difference from many of the other systems, in that, in order to become a Templar, you must be a Trinitarian Christian. Yes, in order to achieve the so-called highest degree in the oldest rite in Freemasonry, you must be a Trinitarian Christian. But here I should probably mention that a major misconception about Freemasonry exists, and it's directly tied to this concept of higher degrees. While these degrees are in large part sequential, and you do have to be a Master Mason before you can become a Mark Master Mason, they're not actually higher. The highest degree in Freemasonry is the third degree, Master Mason, and all other higher degrees are actually lateral or appendant to it. Neither the Knight Templar nor the 33rd degree Mason is superior to the 3rd degree Mason. They're just further along in varying Masonic schools of thought. You might look at this as the Master Mason has a PhD, but the Knight Templar has a PhD and has written 4 books on his subject. So it needs to be understood that while the York and Scottish Rite are both built upon Masonic teachings, neither of them should be considered the true Freemasonry or anything of the sort. True Freemasonry is the 1st through 3rd degree. All of that said, you may be wondering what all this hubbub about the 33rd degree is and why I took so long to get to it. And if you are like that, that's what Masonry is like the whole time through. It's just, I want to learn about this thing. I have to do all of these other things first, though. Fact of the matter is, somebody could sit you down and have you watch the 33rd degree play, but if you're not even an entered apprentice, you're going to have no idea what's going on. And once again, just to be abundantly clear about this, all of this stuff can be found online. All of it. You can find the entire Masonic degree process and you can read it for yourself. Like I said, it's going to be confusing as all hell, but you can do it. Anyway, the 33rd degree is the terminal degree in the Scottish Rite, and the Scottish Rite, more properly the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, is neither ancient nor is it Scottish. It is, however, accepted. There are actually a few different Scottish rites. The Scottish ones from Scotland are much different from this one. But of course, you're probably wondering why it's called the Scottish Rite if it's French, as was I. The Scottish Rite, as we know it, originated with a Frenchman by the name of Estienne Morin, although of course their traditions do claim that it goes back even further than that. The extent to which Masons hold to tradition over established history is kind of complicated to go into. You're going to find people who stick with the tradition, and you're going to find people like me who are very intense about the history. And as far as history goes, Freemasonry made it to France in the year 1720 or thereabouts. And it's thought that the men who brought Freemasonry to France were, in fact, Scottish Jacobite rebels in exile. There are some early records from the 1730s of Scotch lodges and Scotch masters in England and Scotland, though it's very unclear how they differed from the craft degrees, which are 1 through 3. It also seems unlikely that the traditions of those Scotch lodges in England and Scotland were held to particularly closely in France in the quote-unquote Scottish lodges. In 1761, the task of establishing a standardized set of these Scottish Mason degrees fell to Estienne Morin. This early version of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite was referred to as the Order of the Royal Secret. Now, Estienne Morin had been entered into a lodge in Bordeaux, France, sometime between the year 1744, and in 1747, he founded his own one of these Scottish lodges. At this time, French Freemasonry was organized under the Grand Lodge of France, which had been established sometime between 1728 and 1733. And whatever the Scottish lodges were at the time, Morin refined their rituals into 25 specific degrees. And it should be noted that today the Scottish Rite does hold to the claim that most of these degrees already existed and that they were fairly popular at the time. Now, in my opinion, as both a Freemason but more importantly as a historian, Freemasonry was just an absolute mess on the continent at the time. In fact, it was such a mess that a random low-ranking law professor in Bavaria was able to fabricate several degrees and form his own Grand Lodge. By the time the Masons figured out what was actually going on in Bavaria, Adam von Weishaupt and his Order of the Illuminati had become so entrenched that the condemnation of the other Grand Lodges was not enough to uproot them. And the Illuminati eventually caused such a stir that the Prince of Bavaria banned secret societies entirely in 1785. As you can imagine, that was not good for Freemasons in Bavaria. As a result, Freemasons hated the Illuminati with a passion, though it did teach us a lesson, which was that we might need to be a little bit more locked down about what the rights are and who gets to start a Grand Lodge. If you're more interested in the full story of the Illuminati, we actually do have a video on really the whole thing. Yeah, actually, we have a great video on the Illuminati. In any case, the Order of the Royal Secret did not remain in France all that long, and just about a year later it made the voyage across the Atlantic where it took root in the southern colonies. In the north, however, the Royal Arch and the burgeoning York Rite were more popular. But at this point, the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of today did not exist independently from the French Order of the Royal Secret. This would change with the creation of the Supreme Council of the Southern Jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite in 1801, and that was formed in Charleston, South Carolina. This iteration of the Scottish Rite had 33 degrees, though they were not yet standardized and were largely taken from other various rites and Masonic orders. Scottish Rite Masonry as we know it today would not begin to come into form until the 1850s, specifically 1857, when Albert Pike produced a revised edition of the Scottish Rite degree process. Pike made all of the different degrees fit together in an actual sequential way that made sense, rather than having a group of degrees that largely fell in with each other and built upon one another as they had been operating with in the past. Oddly, he did maintain that Frederick II of Prussia was the man who created the 33rd degree, despite there being absolutely no evidence of that. Even today, Scottish Rite Masons don't believe the 33rd degree was created by Frederick II. The only reason I say that the Scottish Rite began to be recognizable as the Scottish Rite of today in 1857 is that Pike's doctrine wasn't immediately accepted. It would really sort of come into its own after he published Morals and Dogma in 1871. He had a lot of time to think after losing the Civil War. Jokes aside, Albert Pike was not a stupid man, and outside of Freemasonry, he was actually pretty influential in the field of Muskogean linguistics. To Masonry, however, Pike is kind of both a gift and a curse. I say that because Pike's style of writing produced passages which, taken out of context, are extremely difficult to explain. For example, one of the reasons that a lot of people think Freemasons are Satanists is due to a little passage in Morals and Dogma. Now, the part of the passage that you frequently see on memes and in YouTube videos claiming Masons are Satanists or Luciferian or whatever reads as follows. Lucifer, the light bearer, strange and mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness. Lucifer, the son of the morning, is it he who bears the light and with its splendors intolerable blinds feeble, sensual, or selfish souls? Doubt it not. And that's usually where it ends. The problem is that's a truncated version of the passage, and the chapter is actually a lot longer. To read the full paragraph, we get, the Apocalypse, Book of Revelation, is, to those who receive the 19th degree, the apotheosis of that sublime faith which aspires to God alone and despises all the pomps and works of Lucifer. Lucifer, the light bearer, strange and mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness. Lucifer, the son of the morning, is it he who bears the light, and with its splendors intolerable blinds feeble, sensual, or selfish souls? Doubt it not, for traditions are full of divine revelations and inspirations, and inspiration is not of one age nor of one creed. Plato and Philo also were inspired. It's appropriate that that passage is about the Book of Revelation because Pike's writing is about as hard to interpret as the Book of Revelation. I'm not going to read the entire chapter and go word for word, sentence by sentence, what's being said, but suffice to say that the message given in this section of the chapter is that inspiration can come from both the spirits of good and the spirits of evil, and that it is the man's job, and specifically the Mason's job, to discern whether inspiration is coming from a good place or not. Without getting too deep into Christian theology here, the character of Satan, or the role of Satan, because it's not always referring to one specific individual, but that figure in the Bible, in the theology, is not evil necessarily. Then bear with me here, hang on. What I mean to say by that is that biblically, you can make the argument, and this is my personal belief as a Christian, that evil is not a thing unto itself, but rather evil is the absence of something, in this case, God. In the same way that darkness is simply the absence of light, evil is simply the absence of good. And as in Christian theology, God is good, the absence of God, or the rejection of God, therefore, would be evil. So when Pike says, Lucifer, the light bearer, strange and mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness, the part you need to connect that to in the passage is when he says, is it he who bears the light, and with its splendors intolerable blinds feeble, sensual, or selfish souls? Doubt it not, for traditions are full of divine revelations and inspirations. What he's saying here is not that Lucifer is God, or that Satan is the good guy. He's saying that Lucifer, Satan, is the deity of the feeble, sensual, and selfish. He's saying that Lucifer, as a figure in theology, has a job. He has a role. He is the Satan. It is his job to accuse. It is his job to oppose. It is his job to try and lead people astray from the path of good. In the Bible, when Satan tempts Jesus, this is basically Satan interacting with God himself. I mean, not just basically, that is what it is. And Satan doesn't attack Jesus. Jesus is there in mortal form. Satan doesn't attack him. Satan challenges him. Satan questions him. He tempts him. He accuses him. But that's the kind of thing you're only going to get out of Pike if you've read not just the entire chapter of Pike, but also spent a lot of time studying the Bible. And to really nail this down before anybody argues with me, this is what the book of Job is about. If you read the book of Job, it's not that Satan out of nowhere just decides to destroy Job's life. Satan goes to God, and this is one of my favorite passages in the entire book because it blatantly tells us that there's like a divine council and that Satan's apparently part of it. Anyway, Satan goes to God, and his exact role on that council isn't totally clear, whether he's like actually a member of the council. Anyway, point is, in Christian theology, Satan's not like a dualist evil god of the darkness. He's an angel who works for God, but is also in rebellion to God. Point is, he goes to God and he says, I don't think anybody would worship you if you didn't give them stuff. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan says, what of him? And God says, he would. And Satan goes, I bet he wouldn't. And God says, all right, go ahead, mess with him. Satan proceeds to do a hell of a lot more than just mess with Job, destroying his entire life, killing his family, killing all of his livestock, destroying his home, his property. And Job, by the end of the book, refuses to give in. He still worships and loves God. And at the end of the book, he's just rewarded for his loyalty and his faith. But what that tells us is that conceiving of Lucifer and Satan in a theological context as being the opposite of God is not correct. In fact, it's quite close to being a dualist heresy. General point of the entire argument is that what Pike was writing about was the fact that good and evil can both inspire people, and you should try to only, take the good inspirations. All of that said, I think we can agree that somebody could have worded that better. He went full esoteric. Never go full esoteric. But while Pike's wording could be improved, the big issue posed by the Scottish Rite is actually not American, it's French. What I mean by that is that the Scottish Rite was adopted as the foundation of something called Le Droit Humain, or Le Droit Humain, or Le Droit Human. I don't know. Detroit become human. Stop putting letters you don't want me to pronounce in words. Regardless, Le Droit Humain is an international order that calls itself Freemasonry and uses the Scottish Rite degrees, but forgoes any actual ancient tradition, and by ancient I do mean just medieval. I want to be very clear that this was not the fault of the Scottish Rite, it was the fault of the French, because in 1773, the Grand Lodge of France gave way to the Grand Orient of France, which followed a much less traditional version of Freemasonry. Now, at the time, there were actually two Grand Lodges in England, and the younger of the two developed because the older of the two had begun to leave behind the things that made Masonry Masonry. At least that was the opinion of the people calling themselves the Ancients. The older order was called the Moderns. Those two lodges eventually set aside their differences and became the United Grand Lodge of England in 1813, and this deal involved going back to the old ways of Masonry, essentially going back to the version that had been established in 1738. In France, however, no such reversion or reformation occurred, and the Grand Orient de France began to abandon more and more of those original Masonic values. As a result of this, the Grand Lodges of the United States and the UK began to distance themselves during the late 19th century. Several American Grand Lodges in the South cut ties with the Grand Orient of France in 1869 over jurisdictional issues, while the major break occurred in 1877, because that's the year that the Grand Orient began to allow atheists. And in addition to that major break, the Grand Orient had also determined that, unlike the English lodges and American lodges, where politics and religion were banned as topics of discussion, in the lodges of France, politics and religion were not only allowed as topics, but in fact encouraged. As I mentioned before, there are really only two core rules of Freemasonry. Those are that you must believe in a supreme deity, and you are not to use the lodge for your own political goals. The Grand Orient was and is in violation of both of those rules, and in 2010 they also began to allow women to join. As a result, so far as the American and British Grand Lodges are concerned, Grand Orient Freemasonry is really just a separate order that uses Masonic symbols, and they're not real Freemasons. The problem is, the Grand Orient says, no, we are Freemasonry, and most people don't know enough to understand the difference between actual Freemasonry and this French-speaking imposter over which we have no control. And I tell you all of this because it's largely due to the pure existence of the Grand Orient that the following events transpired. From the moment that the Catholic Church learned about Freemasonry's existence, they have opposed it. As noted previously, their reasons weren't based upon any sort of actual doctrinal differences or, things that they had caught the Masons doing, but no, it was just vibes. Clement XII's decree on Freemasonry was echoed numerous times by Popes Benedict XIV, Pius VII, Leo XII, Pius VIII, Gregory XVI, and Pius IX, but none of them referred to Freemasonry as Satanist. All of their reasons were largely the same as Clement XII's, that Freemasons met in secret, which meant that they must be perverts who were plotting to take down the Catholic Church. It apparently did not matter that the reason Freemasonry even made it to France in the first place was because it was brought by Catholic Scottish people who were fighting for a Catholic monarch on the throne of England in service of the Catholic Church. This perspective that Freemasonry was bad because it was anti-Catholic, it wasn't, but that's beside the point, but that it wasn't Satanism, it was just anti-clericalism that was the problem, that would change with Pope Leo XIII's Humanum Genus, in which he references St. Augustine's City of God in order to say that there are only two kingdoms in this world, those of God and Satan, or those of good and evil. But I'm not just going to tell you what he said, I'll read you his own words from the document that he wrote in 1884. At every period of time, each kingdom has been in conflict with the other. At this period, however, the partisans of evil, read Satan, seem to be combining together and to be struggling with united vehemence, led on or assisted by that strongly organized and widespread association called the Freemasons. I must laugh at calling the Freemasons strongly organized. We're not strongly organized today, we sure as hell weren't in 1884. All of that was based upon the Masonic constitutions, he does not name which Grand Lodge he's talking about, the Masonic actions, he doesn't say which ones, and the Masonic laws and commentaries, he doesn't name any, which all prove that Masons seek to overthrow both church and state. His only actual evidence of any of this was comprised of a document called the Permanent Instruction, first published in 1859 and attributed to the Italian Carbonari, and two alleged assassination attempts against Father John Bosco in 1880. To start, the Carbonari were a revolutionary sect in Italian politics which had dreams of Italian reunification, and they operated in small cells scattered across the entire Italian peninsula. Their connection to Masonry lay in their practice of accepting Masons as full members of the organization and calling them masters, while non-Masons who joined the organization had to spend 6 months as an apprentice before becoming a master. I'm not going to argue with that. Historians generally agree that they were an offshoot of Italian Freemasonry. Now, the document in question, the Permanent Instruction, was said to have been written by a Jewish member of the Carbonari by the name, or known as, I should say, Piccolo Tigre, or Little Tiger in Italian, and it was said to have been written sometime around the year 1820. The Permanent Instruction outlines a complete blueprint for a Masonic subversion of the Catholic Church with the ultimate goal of destroying Christianity entirely. But something about this document is off. The language is too straightforward and political, lacking any of the trademark allegories of Masonic writing. Consider these two quotes on the concept of patience and growth, one from the Permanent Instruction and one from Morals and Dogma. From the Permanent Instruction by Piccolo Tigre, We do not intend to win popes to our cause, to make them neophytes of our principles, propagators of our ideas. That would be a ridiculous dream, and if events turn out in some way, if cardinals or prelates, for example, of their own free will or by surprise, should enter into a part of our secrets, this is not at all incentive for desiring their elevation to the see of Peter. That elevation would ruin us. Ambition alone would have led them to apostasy. The requirements of power would force them to sacrifice us. What we must ask for, what we should look for and wait for as the Jews wait for the Messiah, is a pope according to our needs. Now we contrast that with morals and dogma. We build slowly and destroy swiftly. Our ancient brethren who built the temples at Jerusalem, with many myriad blows, felled, hewed, and squared the cedars, and quarried the stones and carved the intricate ornaments which were to be the temples. Stone after stone, by the combined effort and long toil of apprentice, fellowcraft, and master, the walls arose. Slowly the roof was framed and finished, and many years elapsed before, at length, the houses stood finished, all fit and ready for the worship of God, gorgeous in the sunny splendors of the atmosphere of Palestine. So they were built. A single motion of the arm of a rude, barbarous Assyrian spearman, or drunken Roman or Gothic legionary of Titus, moved by a senseless impulse of the brutal will, flung in the blazing brand, and, with no further human agency, a few short hours sufficed to consume and melt each temple to a smoking mass of black, unsightly ruin. Be patient, therefore, my brother, and wait. Masonry is all about symbols and metaphors and deeper meanings, and yet the Permanent Instructions author goes straight to the point. It just doesn't sound Masonic at all. So when I first read that, I was skeptical, because I've read a lot of Masonic texts, and it just doesn't fit. It sounds more like Catholic writing than it does Masonic writing. And being a historian, I was aware that there have been a few instances in history where the Catholic Church has forged documents in order to achieve their goals. So that's why when I got to the publisher of this alleged Masonic text, the Permanent Instruction, that I kind of just immediately was like, oh, okay, this makes sense now. It was published by the Catholic Church. Now, they claimed that, it was written by the Carbonari and everybody should know what they're up to, and that's why they released it. But I don't think I need to explain the most likely course of events that led to this being published. But because this is a YouTube video, what I'm saying is that it's most likely that this is a document that was written by the Catholic Church. And it's not that it just doesn't sound Masonic, it's that absolutely nothing in the document calls upon any Masonic symbolism. It reads like something written by a person who was familiar with revolutionary attitudes of the Carbonari, but not actual Masonic doctrine or philosophy. As for the assassination issue, allegedly 2 attempts were made on the life of Father John Bosco, now Saint John Bosco, in the year 1880. In the first attempt, the attacker broke down and confessed that he had become a Freemason and that the Grand Masters had ordered the death of Father John Bosco. 12 men had been chosen by lot to kill the priest, one after the others, until somebody succeeded. This unfortunate young man was first in line in what is the most unusual Scott Pilgrim fanfic I've ever read. The second assassin came during the winter, and I just need to read this to you word for word. Aiden, give me the mood lighting. In one of his frantic flailings, a small 6-chambered handgun slid out of his pocket and onto the sofa. Unnoticed, Don Bosco put his hand over it and deftly pocketed it. Meanwhile, his visitor began provoking him into a quarrel. At a certain point, he suddenly looked swiftly about him and thrust his hand into his pocket. Rummaging with increasing surprise and anger, he sprang to his feet, looking about him, unable to regain his composure. Don Bosco also stood up and, as the man kept searching anxiously, asked with great calm, "What are you looking for?" "I had something in here, in my pocket, and I can't find it. Where did it go?" "Maybe you only thought you had it with you," Don Bosco suggested. "These are not the droids you're looking for." "Nonsense!" the young man replied, and fidgeted about the room, straying also into the next room. Don Bosco quickly stepped to the outer door of that room, grasping the doorknob with his left hand so as to be able to open it quickly. He leveled the revolver against the man and calmly stated, "This is what you were looking for, isn't it?" At first, the scoundrel stood, dumbfounded, but as he moved to get his hands on the gun, Don Bosco firmly told him, "Get out fast, and may God have mercy on you." He flung the door open and bade several people waiting in the anteroom to escort the man out of the oratory. The would-be murderer hesitated, but Don Bosco firmly stated, "Get out, and never return." He finally complied, and 2 members of the oratory took him as far as the street, where a group of hoodlums clustered in conversation beside a waiting coach. As soon as they realized that the attempt had failed, some leapt into the coach and dashed off, while others took to their heels. The young man was left alone and walked off, crestfallen, along Via Cotalengo. I don't think I need to elaborate any further on why I am skeptical that this happened. Obviously, these are both massively unreliable sources of information, but that did not stop Pope Leo XIII from using them as evidence that Freemasons were Satanists. And that gave a man by the name of Marie Joseph Gabriel Antoine Yogan Paget an idea. That idea was to change his public name to Leo Taxil. His second idea was more complicated. Leo Taxil had been an outspoken and prolific anti-Catholic writer, but he saw an opportunity to make some money and play a pretty funny joke on both Masons and Catholics by feigning a conversion and then writing a series of anti-Masonic books to thunderous Catholic applause. He wrote several sets of volumes, one of which was an academic-styled history of Freemasonry, and another a set of essentially novels about a French doctor, a surgeon, who infiltrated the Masons and was recording everything they did. And in his writings, he claimed that at the top levels of Freemasonry, there was a class called the Paladists, and that the Paladists secretly worshipped Baphomet, communed with demons, sacrificed goats, and partied with severed heads, and all of this was run by Albert Pike. He even cited a witness, an American woman by the name of Diana Vaughan, who was the former Grand Inspector of the Grand Palladium, but converted to Catholicism after she found out about Joan of Arc. Taxil's work won him money, fame, and even a meeting with the Pope, but by 1897, the journalists were beginning to wonder if he ever could produce proof of this. Some had a hard time believing his stories about the time that the devil turned himself into a crocodile who played piano so that he could marry a Mason, and others questioned why they'd never seen Diana Vaughan in person. In response to all of this, Taxil held a press conference where he promised to produce Diana Vaughan in person, there, in the flesh for everybody to see. But when the journalists arrived and Taxil began speaking, what he actually did was confess the entire hoax, beginning with the character he used to basically fabricate all of his claims, a Dr. Batali. It's French. He said, "Now I address myself to the Catholics. I tell them, when you were told that Dr. Batal, pretending to be a devoted to the Catholic cause, spent 11 years of his life exploring the darkest dens of secret societies, lodges, and back lodges, and even Luciferian triangles, you fully approved him. You found his behavior admirable. He was overwhelmed with congratulations. Laudatory articles were written even in the publications of the party which, today, can't hurl enough thunderbolts to reduce Miss Diana Vaughan to ashes, here calling her a myth, there an adventuress and a fortune teller. Should the cheers which greeted Dr. Batal be now reconsidered, they existed nonetheless and were thunderous. Illustrious theologians, eloquent preachers, eminent prelates congratulated him, each louder than the other, and I do not say they were wrong. I merely and simply determine a fact, and the purpose of this determination is to allow me to say forthrightly. Do not get angry, my reverend fathers, but I do laugh heartily when you are told now that what did happen is the very opposite of what you expected. There wasn't the shadow of a dedicated Catholic exploring the high masonry of palladism under a false nose. But, on the contrary, there has been a freethinker who, for his own edification, not because of any hostility, came into your camp and strolled, not during 11 years, but during 12, and it is your servant." The transcript noted that there were various reactions, including murmuring and laughter. He continued, "There wasn't the least Masonic plot in this story, which I shall prove to you shortly. We must leave to Homer singing the exploits of Ulysses, the adventure of the legendary Trojan horse. That formidable horse has nothing to do in this case. Today's tale is much less intricate. Your servant told himself once that having gone for irreligion too young and possibly with too much spirit, it was well possible that he might not be aware of the true situation. Then, not acting in anybody's name, willing to change his mind if there were reasons to do so, and trusting no one at first with his decision, he thought he had found the means of knowing better, of ascertaining better, for his own instruction. Add to this, if you wish, a touch of prank at the back of his temper. He wasn't born in Marseille in vain. Yes, add the lovely pleasure that most people ignore, but which is quite real, the intimate joy of playing a good turn on an opponent, without malice, just for fun and to have some laughs. Well, I must say so at once. This 12-year-long prank taught me something valuable from the start. Namely, that I had acted without moderation indeed, that I should have better stayed on the ground of ideas, and that in most cases, it had been a mistake to make personal attacks. This was a reference to the fact that he had written I believe it was called the Loves of Pope Pius VIII or something like that. I didn't read that document, but I'm guessing it contains some homoerotic materials. He continues, I feel bound to make such a statement, and I also admit that I make it easily. During these 12 years spent under the banner of the church, and although I registered as a prankster, I realized how wrong it is to impute the malice of some people to doctrines. It results from mankind itself. A bad man remains bad, just like a good man acts with goodness, whether he keeps his faith or loses it. Dishonest people as well as honest ones are found everywhere. Accordingly, I made for myself a study which has borne fruit. That study gave me the equanimity, the inner philosophy mentioned before. I came at first as a curious person, a bit at random, but of course intending to withdraw once the experience had come to its end. Then, the sweet pleasure of pranking took over, overwhelming everything. I lingered in the Catholic camp, gradually developing my plan of an altogether amusing and instructive mystification, and giving it ever broader proportions as things went along. In the course of time, I happened to secure 2 collaborators. Not more than 2. One was a fellow I knew since childhood, whom I took at first for a ride, and to whom I ascribed the pseudonym of Dr. Batal. The other was Miss Diana Vaughan, a French Protestant, rather on the free-thinking side, a professional typist, and the representative of one of the typewriter manufacturers in the United States. I needed both to achieve the success of the last episode of this joyful prank, which American newspapers call the biggest hoax of modern times. I will say it was a little hard to track down Taxel's writings in English, so I'm not sure the exact details of what he said. There is currently a Kickstarter going to publish his works in English for the first time. I want to take a look at it before I tell anybody to contribute to it, but I might contribute myself if it seems worthwhile. From what I understand, there was the history of Freemasonry given, and then I'm unsure of the exact nature of the Dr. Batal character, whether these were novels or whether these were supposed to be, autobiographies or biographies. But honestly, that's not even the biggest problem that we're dealing with in this whole thing. You see, the group of people who influenced and inspired Leo XIII to write his document condemning Freemasonry, the Carbonari, they were under the Grand Orient of Italy. So Freemasons, actual Freemasons, had nothing to do with any of this. So, even if everything that the Catholics said about the Carbonari were true, the Freemasons had nothing to do with any of it. The Grand Orient did. The Grand Orient of Italy developed out of the Grand Orient of France, similar to how the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania developed out of the Grand Lodge of England. So the Carbonari would have fallen under the Grand Orient, and therefore they would not have been Freemasons. They would have been Freemasons, I guess. Something else entirely. Taxel's work also has abundant problems, which of course it would because he knew he was playing a prank, but one example here is that he provides images, woodcuts, woodprints, and in one he presents a mixed gender lodge, which is something you could have in French Freemasonry, but not in Scottish Rite. And I specify Scottish Rite because Taxel was saying that this whole thing was led by Albert Pike. I should clarify that in both British and American Masonry, women are not allowed. Women who wish to be involved with Masonry, if they are married to a Mason or the daughter of a Mason, can join the Order of the Eastern Star, which is a women's organization that is very similar to Freemasonry. And it is attached to Freemasonry. It is funded by Freemasonry. There are also youth organizations within Masonry. Sons of Masons can join Demolay, whereas daughters of Masons can join Rainbow Girls and Job's Daughters. And these function very similarly to Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. Although I guess it's just Scouts now. Also, in addition to that confession that Taxel gave in 1897, he gave another one in 1907. He said the following in an interview with the National Magazine, an American publication. "The public made me what I am, the arch liar of the period. For when I first commenced to write against the Masons, my object was amusement pure and simple. The crimes I laid at their door were so grotesque, so impossible, so widely exaggerated, I thought everybody would see the joke and give me credit for originating a new line of humor. But my readers wouldn't have it so. They accepted my fables as gospel truth, and the more I lied for the purpose of showing that I lied, the more convinced became they that I was a paragon of veracity. Then it dawned on me that there was lots of money in being a Munchausen of the right kind, and for 12 years I gave it to them hot and strong, but never too hot. When indicting such slush as the story of the devil snake who wrote prophecies on Diana's back with the end of his tail, I sometimes said to myself, 'Hold on, you are going too far.' But I didn't. My readers even took kindly to the yarn of the devil who, in order to marry a Mason, transformed himself into a crocodile and, despite the masquerade, played the piano wonderfully well. One day, when lecturing at Lille, I told my audience that I had just had an apparition of Nautilus, the most daring affront on human credulity I had so far risked. But my hearers never turned a hair. 'Hear ye, the doctor has seen Nautilus,' they said with admiring glances. Of course, no one had a clear idea of who Nautilus was. I didn't myself, but they assumed he was a devil." I love the I didn't myself. Man literally got up while, giving a sermon and he's like, "Behold, I have had a vision of Nautilus!" The jolly evenings I spent with my fellow authors hatching out new plots, new unheard of perversions of truth and logic, each trying to outdo the other in organized mystification. I thought I would kill myself laughing at some of the things proposed, but everything went, there is no limit to human stupidity. Having covered Tartaria and the flat earth in the last year? Unfortunately, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. And while Leo Taxil's confessions were published in numerous places, they never made it quite so far as his falsehoods. As a result, many people believed his descriptions and depictions to be truthful. The actual truth about Freemasonry, however, is that it's nowhere near as exciting as it's made out to be. But it is a very storied fraternity. Freemasonry is especially intertwined with American history, for example, as at least 9 and possibly up to 21 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons, and a further 13 signed the Constitution. Beyond just signing documents, Freemasons were also extensively involved in the Revolution itself. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine printed revolutionary materials for the masses, while Baron von Steuben and George Washington led our armies against the British. Masons led armies on both sides of the Civil War, thousands stormed the trenches of the Argonne, and 25 years later, their sons liberated Europe. Edward Jenner and Alexander Fleming, pioneers of the smallpox vaccine and penicillin, were both British Master Masons. 15 presidents were known Freemasons, spanning 4 major American political parties. Among them was my favorite Bigfoot hunter, Teddy Roosevelt, and while not a president, another American hero, the second man on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, was a Freemason. Is a Freemason. He's still alive, isn't he? Yeah, is a Freemason. Today, American Masonic charities alone donate on average $2.6 million to charity every day. This provides funding for medical research, free medical care for children, homes for Masonic widows, scholarships for Masonic youth, and a host of other things. So, while Masonry has this reputation as some dark, shadowy secret society looking to take over the world in service of Satan, the truth is that almost every single Mason you'll ever meet is just a man trying to do better. Every Freemason I know is striving to be a better person. They're all pretty good family men, they all work steady jobs, and they're all there for each other when somebody needs a hand up. Every Mason I personally know is very active in their community. They help fundraise for things around town, they go to PTA meetings, they volunteer, they do the best that they can to make the community they're in a better place. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every Mason is a good person or that they're better people than the average. What I will tell you is that the goal of Freemasonry at its core is to make good men better. I also don't intend with this video to tell you that no Freemason has ever done anything wrong, or that there aren't certain sects of Freemasonry that are a little weird. My only intention in producing this video was to give you guys all of the information I could about the origin of Freemasonry and how the myth of Satanism within the order developed. There are probably a lot of other Masonic topics that we will eventually touch on this channel. We'll probably talk about the Scottish Rite in more detail. We'll probably talk about that, possible connection to the Knights Templar and some of the other evidences for it, because there are even claims that the Templars made it over to America. We also do fully intend to make a video on that time that an Italian Masonic lodge did actually try to take over the Italian government, but again, I had to go through all of this so that I could explain that Grand Orient Freemasonry isn't Freemasonry. So yeah, it's technically a Masonic lodge. No, it's not the kind of Freemasonry that you'd encounter in your day-to-day life, especially in the United States. Freemasonry is like any organization, and Freemasons are like any other people. We have flaws, we try to rectify them, and sometimes we have schisms and disagreements. The important thing is that we call out evil when we see it, and I will continue to do that regardless of my Masonic affiliation or not. So, with all of that said, if you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can subscribe to us on Patreon or here on YouTube for just $1 a month. That gets you access to our exclusive content here, which is not that kind of exclusive content, don't be naughty, but it is a nice sitting back, having a few, and talking about history. We also do occasionally post articles, sort of like pseudo blog posts, and also in advance announcements and discounts for things that we are offering to the general public as well. You could also support us by buying some of our merch, which is soon switching to Bunker branding, or also by purchasing our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company. It is delicious. I designed it myself, did not pick it off a shelf. I talked to a roaster. The best place to get updates for our channel is the Discord, which you can join by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge. And if you want more Lodge, you can always check us out on our other channels. We have the Weird Bible, we have my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, where I stream less frequently than I used to, but still usually Thursday and Friday nights. We also have the History Hut, which we're still trying to figure out how we're going to put content on there. And we're very excited to announce that we have a whole bunch of new shows coming out that are going to be on other channels on the Redacted Media Network. Those will be podcasts for the most part to start, covering topics like music, the service industry. We have a fitness one coming online. Got a whole bunch of stuff in store. And if you want to catch our podcast, that is live Sunday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, if you are catching this video before May 26, 2024, there is still time to join our trip to Alaska. We've partnered with TrovaTrip to run a 7-day excursion up there, where we will be going to Anchorage, Denali, and Seward. And in Seward, we will actually be shooting parts of an episode live. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to it. And if you would like to join us, go to the link in the description and sign up for the trip. You can pay 25% down and then set up a payment plan with a firm to cover the rest over the next 6, 12, or 18 months if you lack the funds to subscribe to the whole thing right now. With all of that said, I am Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.